Well, it's about time somebody's doing something serious to save the planet. Hi, this is Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Mayor Bill de Blasio, a fellow Bill in New York City, has decided to allow students to skip school on Friday in order to be part of a global protest involving climate change, marking the time when there's a climate change conference going on in New York City. Bill, some 1.1 million New York City students are allowed to skip class without penalty, and districts across the country are considering something similar, including in Cambridge, Mass, as well as your own LA Unified School District. Bill, first of all, isn't it good to see young people engaged in politics?
Yeah, and not only that, my first thought upon hearing the news was that hopefully it'll be an international conference, and it'll give American kids a day off and give those other kids in the other industrialized nation a chance to catch up to our educational system.
Well, certainly. I mean, we obviously want education for everybody around the world, but in this case,
no, but I'm just saying we got to take our foot off the gas because our educational lead is so expansive that it's nice to give our guys a break after all the hard work they do and let the other kids catch up a bit.
Bill, it sounds like you're saying that we can't spare a day in the classroom where we're listening to lectures or perhaps watching videos.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
In fact, what Bill de Blasio is doing is saying he wants students to be engaged in real world change. Isn't that what we want for our kids, Bill?
If New York City were genuinely going under the waves and Bill de Blasio gave the school a day off so that they could shovel sand into sandbags and put them along the Hudson and East Rivers, then I'd be totally in favor of that. That would be an actual sacrifice that would be worthwhile. This is going to come as a shock to people, but Manhattan does not seem to be in any significantly more danger of going underwater than it was in 2005 when we told that in 2015 it would be underwater. I'm not going to make this about the global warming thing. At the very, 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 very least, no matter what your position on global warming is, climate change, excuse me, because both up and down temperature changes now are caused by us. Whatever your position on climate change is, I think the one thing that can pretty much stand the task of any reasonable examination is that the predictions that were made to us in the early 2000s have not come true. There's still snow. There's still polar ice caps. New York City is not a foot deep in water. So given the fact that our educational system is 17th in the world or something like that. I learned yesterday, it's yesterday, by the way, that when Jimmy Carter created the Department of Education, we were first in the world, and now we're 17th.
Well, that only seems fair to spread the learning around, doesn't it?
Yes, no, absolutely. Absolutely. This is kind of the socialist principle at work. Why should we take more than our fair share of knowledge when there are other people in the world who don't have as much educational opportunities as we do? And so de Blasio's socialist instincts come shining through again. Look, when you get right down to it, you put all the snark aside, what this is early level political indoctrination into left-wing causes. And this doesn't surprise me, but it does mortify me.
Bill, some have suggested that Mayor de Blasio, who is a Democrat, is in fact using his powerful position not just to indoctrinate students, but to advance a political agenda at the expense of the taxpayers. One would assume that if students don't think they have to come to school, many of them won't come to school, not necessarily engaged in marching to save the planet. Do you think de Blasio would, as a major accountable political figure, would actually do something just so cravenly political? Or are you more on the side of his defenders who say it's about time somebody stood up and saved this planet?
Yeah. First of all, my only hope for this catastrophe now, it's not a catastrophe, it's just another pimple on the elephant back as we.
Now, are you talking about the catastrophe of the destruction of the planet, or
the fact
that a million kids are going to miss school?
That second one.
Okay.
It's a pimple on the back of the elephant charging into hell. But my hope is that if the students are given the day off from school, that they won't go to the protest. My hope is they will go down to a street corner and start shooting craps or something, which at least will give them some kind of fundamental instruction in mathematics and economics, perhaps even in statistics, which they're certainly not getting in the New York public school system. But let's come to this term that is just the term the decade, the term the millennia, and that's saving the planet. That's a pretty big statement to make, saving the planet. Like every other kind of virtue signaling, it magnifies the pitiful little things that we're asked to do in the course of our day into champion activities, into almost acts of Olympians. We're gonna get together and we're gonna save this planet.
Well, Bill, even if you're right about that, isn't it better that people feel they're doing something than to feel utterly helpless?
No, it is not. First of all, the entire thing is a gigantic scare tactic. It is whatever you want to say about the data. Whatever you want to say about the data and what is actually happening or not happening, what is beyond question, is that people are living in a state of absolute terror perpetrated by people like Bill de Blasio and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who are telling young people we have 10 years or else it's all over. They've been telling us we have 10 years or else it's all over pretty much through modern history. But put that aside. The problem with getting fired up about phony ideas is that it prevents you from dealing with the real ideas. Instead of trying to save the planet, how about if we were trying to fix the educational system in New York City? That would be something that is at least theoretically achievable. This planet has been through quite a bit in the course of its life. There's still a fair amount of life in the old girl yet. This just to make the case, in the center of Kansas, 80 million years ago was underneath 2 miles of water because it was an inland ocean. Carbon dioxide levels weren't at 450, we're at 3,000. 80,000 years ago, that same area was under a mile of ice, and carbon dioxide levels were so low that plant life nearly died. We had nothing to do with either of those two things, and the planet survived just fine, because if the planet did not have these kind of feedback mechanisms to correct itself, we would have been either an ice ball or an ash a long, long, long time ago.
Well, Bill, it almost sounds like you are suggesting that the whole climate change movement on the part of the progressive left is nothing but the bombing of an aspirin factory to distract from what's really going on in the legislature.
Well, imagine that. Yes, that's exactly right. And not only is it a distraction, it's also a primary motivation. That primary motivation is fear. When the Cold War ended, kids these days, Scott, these kids, the things they're afraid of. When I was a kid, I was worried about nuclear war. That was something to be worried about. And it turns out that's not just a sarcastic statement. That was genuinely something to be worried about. That was genuinely something that could have ended the world. That was a civilization. The planet would have been here just fine.
Also within the control of human beings, which some might say climate change is not as much.
Correct. So it does strike me that not very long at all after, in fact, starting considerably before, the fear of a full-scale thermonuclear war going toe-to-toe with the Ruskies is, as soon as that threat subsided, very rapidly it was replaced with another existential threat that was hanging over everybody's heads, and that kept people in this state of constant anxiety, if not absolute terror. And I find that to be more common throughout history than it really should be. There are two ways to look at this. One of them is that politicians understand the power that keeping people frightened has for them, because as the government and as the most powerful force in society, even our government, which is supposed to be as extremely small as possible, still remains the most powerful single force in our society. People turn to that kind of authority in times of crisis. So it suits the people in authority to maintain that level of crisis. That's one way of looking at it. A more charitable way of looking at it, which may be true, and it's probably a combination of both. A more charitable way of looking at it would be to say that it is a survival trait for humans to worry. In other words, the humans that didn't worry about putting a guard up at the night, in the edge of the cave because there's no chance, the leopard's not going to come in here, everything's fine. Those guys are not around anymore. The people that did post the sentries survived to tell the tale and have kids. There is an interesting theory about the worry mechanism that's built into humanity. And basically what this theory says is that we will worry to the limit of our capacity to worry, because that is a pro-survival, very, very positive trait in terms of survival. And that if we don't have actual threats to worry about, we will take whatever threat is available and magnify it up to that top level of worry, because that top level of worry is built into the human consciousness.
So you're saying this is good for our school kids to keep their worry blade sharp, right?
Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, what happens is, as you worry more and more and more about smaller and smaller things, your emotional trigger gets more and more sensitive. And this is why when you see reports of a school that was put into emergency lockdown, teachers bolting the doors and all the rest of this stuff, calling the SWAT team because some kid had chewed a Pop-Tart into the general shape of a semi-automatic pistol. Those people that make those decisions have a fear response that is so hair-triggered that these kind of absurdities happen. Now, if you compare that response with those of a member of a SEAL team, let's say, who doesn't have to worry about Pop-Tarts in the shape of guns, has to worry about real guns and getting shot at all the time, you'll find that SEAL team members are not driven to hysteria at the sight of a Pop-Tart that has been generally munched into the shape of a pistol. Their concern is real pistols. So no, it is not a benefit. What it actually does is it magnifies all of the trivial things in our lives into monumental acts of sacrifice and fear and all the rest of it. It accomplishes the virtue signaling. It accomplishes the psychological fear of the population to keep them constantly worried and constantly looking to the government. It's a no-lose situation for them. And the only thing I suspect that must bother them is that the evidence of their predictions has been so far short of what they predicted that it would be an actual genuine problem for them if it weren't for the fact that they controlled all of the media outlets and no one is saying what everybody knows.
Well, I would say quite to the contrary, Bill.
Al Gore said, hang on, just to put a button on it, Al Gore said in 2005, we have 10 years. And Rush Limbaugh, to his undying credit, the man's a genius, immediately started the Al Gore death clock with 10 years and a countdown, a constant countdown. And in 2015, when our time was up and the planet was dead, you can only imagine the kind of coverage that got. In other words, we make these outrageous predictions about global cooling, global warming, back and forth, ozone layer is going to kill us, everything. And when these things don't happen, instead of saying, well, it looks like we overestimated that threat, maybe we got to think about actually how much worrying we should be doing. We just move on to the next threat. And it would be Ebola, or it'll be killer bees, or it'll be Africanized killer bees, or it will be the bees are disappearing, or it'll be something to keep people in this perpetual state of anxiety and actual fear, which suits the people in government and which I personally believe we're wired for.
Well, I think the advocates of anthropogenic climate change or man-made global warming would say that, in fact, evidence has presented itself. And if you pay attention to the news, you'll see all the time there are more stories about how we've had the hottest day ever here and we've had the wettest or driest there. And there's all kinds of evidence. Something that kind of puts the lie to your analogy with the Cold War and the nuclear threat, simply because nobody during the nuclear threat process over those decades could say, it's happening, because it wasn't happening.
Well, now we get down to what I think is probably the single most important issue with this whole climate change thing. I'm willing to concede, because I have a good layman's scientific background. I'm willing to concede that there are changes there. I'm not conceding it, but I'm certainly willing to look at the evidence, and I certainly do not believe it impossible that humans are influencing the climate. But here's the part that this is the part where I just get off of the whole thing. And this is the part where I start fighting people who are talking about climate change. Instead of dealing with the actual issue, the actual forecasts, and what actually might be done, what they do is they immediately treat all of the citizens of this country like children. And this is the part that I have a profound objection to. What they do, scientists, politicians, and all of them, is let's just say that the data is there for the sake of the argument. Let's say that the data is there, that the threat is real, and so on. If they had treated the American people like citizens and adults and told us the extent of the problem in realistic terms, then I would be very willing to look at what was going on and I would have some trust in them. But that is not what they've done. What they've done, beginning with An Inconvenient Truth, although I'm sure it started before then, is to amplify the effects to the point where people are so terrified that they will do whatever they need to do in order to comply with this. Now, you could say, and certainly the scientists do say when they're confronted with the fact that New York is not under a foot of water, as they predicted, or at least as some of them did, what they will say is that the problem is so serious that we have to exaggerate it so that the American people will understand how important it is. And to that I say, you go straight to hell, you elitist snob, you son of a bitch. Who do you think you are talking to? You know, this idea that the great unwashed masses, just a herd of people rampaging in fear in whichever direction they happen to be steered by our intellectual betters. This is the thing about climate science that is so disgraceful and so disgusting. And furthermore, the fact that all of the data, all of the emails, all of the conspiracy to change and alter data has been done to change and alter data in the direction that they want it to go. If this data was as solid as they say it was, they wouldn't need to change data. They wouldn't need to invent the hockey stick, which is statistical invention. It's simply taking a dip and turning it on its side. They wouldn't have to do these things if they had the kind of data that anybody reasonably could look at. But let's just say that they did have that data. I am not going to be a party to treating the human race, and especially the citizens of this country, as infantile children who are incapable of understanding anything other than do what we tell you or else we're all going to die. I'm not going to be a part of that. I'm going to fight that tooth and nail. If they want to present some actual data about what's actually happening and give us some reasonable expectations of what this will mean, instead of telling us that if I don't throw this plastic bottle in the right container, the planet will die, then I'd be willing to talk sensibly about this. But until that happens, I'm going to be opposed to them simply because there is no question whether they're lying about the change or the data is open for discussion. But there is no question, none, that they are exaggerating, enormously exaggerating what the consequences of global warming would be. And when they gave up calling it global warming, that was when I stopped believing them personally, because global warming is a trend that can be tracked. Global warming is something that you could actually see as an abnormal tick. But when they say they're trying to fight climate change, the entire term is a non sequitur. What does that mean? The climate has been changing all the time. When they say the climate is changing, do they mean it's changing from the 1970 climate? Do they mean it's changing from the 1860 climate? Do they mean it's changing from the 1540 climate? Do they mean it's changing from the climate of 80,000 years ago when we had ice sheets all over America? Do they mean it's changing from the climate of 80 million years ago when it was 120 degrees and 100% humidity in Kansas and there were plesiosaurs and pterodactyls and all of those fossils are there? So this is the part of it that I find to be absolutely disgraceful and just plain lying. And I have no reason to credit them with this other than for their political agenda, which seems very much to me to be to take the money away from the people that are doing the producing and to be sure to shut down capitalism. Because if you think about the fact that before the fall of the Soviet Union, there was the first world, the second world, and the third world. The second world disappeared, and all of those citizens of the second world didn't just suddenly vanish. I think this idea that this whole thing is a watermelon thing, green on the outside, red on the inside. I think you've got some fairly compelling, very compelling evidence that this is in fact what's happened.
Well, moms and dads, on Friday morning, as you sit down to breakfast with your family, to your meal of free-range chicken eggs as well as fake bacon, you might want to take a moment after you're done praying to the Lord to share this video with your kids who are about to skip the day at school, and to thank the members at BillWhittle.com who have made it, in fact, possible for you to enjoy this video. There's 1.1 million children out there who need an education, and BillWhittle.com stands ready to educate them. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making this possible.